Good game. Wait, don't go yet. I have so much to tell you. I don't know your name, and I won't tell you mine. I think it's better this way, for both of us. Please look over this before you move on to your next match. My experience began much like yours. When I got the new chess.com challenge, I thought it looked a bit strange. There was no username, no flag to indicate their country, and no ranking. I figured it was some sort of glitch, and went ahead and accepted. It was not an easy game, and I enjoyed the challenge of it, so when I'd finally checkmated them, I immediately sent a rematch invitation. They never accepted and didn't respond to my good game message. I am fairly certain that same night was the first time that I had the nightmare. I was wandering through ornate halls, gold and cheery paintings everywhere. It was daylight outside, sunlight painted the already colorful room in blues and greens through a stained glass window above my head and glinted off chandeliers. It was beautiful, well, at least it was at first, until I tried to leave. I wandered for hours in my dream, my eyes slowly dissolving away into distress. As I went from room to room, up and down a narrow marble staircase, and under vaulted ceilings, day gave way into night, and the interior felt colder, aloof. I looked closely at the intricate paintings and mosaics in each room for any sort of hint, something, anything. The scenes were not the same as when I had first arrived, either. They showed awful things, things that no one ever want to immortalize on a mural. The pastel colors made it feel all the more wrong. As I went room to room, I realized that they were the same, not just the painting or the mirrors that never seemed to reflect anything back at me. Everything, every single room, was the copy of the first one I'd entered. I'd only been seeing a bit of it before, not enough to notice, but now that I looked, now that I wandered through room after room after room, and I realized it was all the same, just more and more revealed each time until it became so large that the lone chandelier failed to illuminate everything within that space. And in the shadows far beyond the reach of the light, I knew that it was here. It had always been here with me. It was just now I was so close to seeing, even though I didn't want to, so very close. And then, I woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning, I saw an invitation to a tournament, the night tournament. The name sounded corny, so I couldn't help but laugh, but still, I was intrigued. It was an invitation only, and mentioned that I'd been invited on the basis of my recent win. I'd won several of the games I'd played recently, so I wasn't sure which game, or even which site, it was in relation to. The premise really fascinated me. The email was simple and clean, minimal white text on a black background. The prize was simply described as the prize, and the tournament was in a palace. A palace. I found it funny at the time that the night tournament began in the afternoon. I showed up early so I'd have some time to calm my nerves before the tournament began. But the moment the heavy wooden doors shut behind me, I froze. The marble, the gold, the bright paintings, it sent a shiver down my spine because this was the exact place from my nightmare. Although I know now, I couldn't remember at the time had I had the dream before or after I received the invitation. I knew I'd never been in person, but was it at all possible that I'd maybe just Googled the location and saw the interior, forgotten, and then nerves from the competition messed with my mind, making it the location of my torment? The marble staircase, the one from my dreams, tucked away further into the entrance, had a sign directing me to the check-in desk. I wished that the airy staircase, with the wide steps, and the marble railing was the one we were directed to rather than the narrow one, tucked further in, with nothing but plain walls on either side. I found the desk to check in, and since I was so early, at first it wasn't that unusual that I was the first participant there. I did expect to see at least someone manning the desk, but I figured I'd go ahead and write my name. As I approached the desk, I found the sign in sheets. They were held in place by clipboards that could barely contain the plethora of pages. Curious, I looked and realized there were hundreds of people already signed in, and I felt a moment of panic. Was I late? But as I looked more closely, I realized the dates were all old, some by several months, dating back decades to some of the more fragile paper. I guess they were just cheap as hell, or oddly meticulous record keepers, and I signed in. I found the instructions to put my phone in a locker, and I did so. I waited for an hour, sat alone in the empty room as the sun filtered in through the stained glass skylights, reflected upon the rows and rows of boards and shiny plastic of the pieces. I checked my watch at 13:45, so about 30 minutes late, but decided I'd give them another hour to show. Something about the place felt so hollow, as if it hadn't been filled in a very long time. To pass the time, I figured I'd play a game by myself, recreate one I'd just played, and try a different tactic. I'd moved my first piece, figured I'd play the Sokolsky opening, because why the hell not, when I heard something behind me, like the rustle of dry leaves. I looked over my shoulder, thinking I'd finally encountered another participant, but I didn't see anyone there. When I turned back to the board, I realized that the black pieces weren't all lined up. I could have sworn they were moments before, but shrugged it off, sat the wayward pawn back in line, and moved a black piece the way I'd planned to. In the moment I blinked, the pieces were in different places again. I moved again, my side only, and stared, eyes wide and unmoving, at the board. Nothing happened. I closed my eyes, held them closed for a few long moments, and when I'd opened them, sure enough, the other side had moved. I've read and seen enough horror to know that was my cue to run. I ran to the lockers with the intent of grabbing my phone, but they were gone. The hallway stretched far beyond my field of view in either direction, so I picked what I was fairly confident was the way I came in and sprinted down it. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that every painting in the hallway was the same, that I never made it any closer to the stairs, much less the exits. Each room was a copy of the one I'd first entered down to the position of the pieces on the board, but painted in shadow. As the sun set, as the lone chandelier had to contend with what seemed like endless darkness at the corner of the rooms. With every other avenue exhausted, I decided the only thing to do was finish the game. I chose a room at random, and after a moment of sitting in silence so absolute that the sound of my breathing was the only thing shattering it, I made my next move. It took a while, as whatever sat across the table from me wouldn't move until I broke sight with the board and averted my eyes. It was an easy win, but not the kind you feel good about. It was more so like when you're playing someone just learning the game and how the pieces move, and almost feel a little guilty beating them. By the time the game had ended, it felt as if hours had passed. Sure enough, I looked up to see it was entirely dark out. For a moment, I could have sworn the window was a bit further away than it had been when I started, but dismissed the thought quickly. I heard what sounded like a soft sigh, and turned back to see that the board was gone. I saw the glint of the artificial lighting on a board though, several tables down, just bordering where the light faded into shadow. I sat down. This time the set was older looking, the pieces were heavier. I was black, and a white knight had already been moved. That game was more challenging. The mysterious they that I was playing clearly knew the rules of the game, and played well. It would have been enjoyable, even under different circumstances. I won again, but for the first time wondered what exactly would happen if I had lost. Once again, when I broke eye contact with the board in front of me, it was gone again. The room was large enough that I had to wander up and down the rows of tables to locate the next board. I gravitated back towards the light where I'd started, but it probably goes without saying, that was not where I found it. This set was different. I could tell by touch that it was made of wood, and after my eyes adjusted to the scant light, I realized that the pieces left a residue that seeped brown-black into the paler wood grain of the white squares, and burned my hands slightly. When I touched them, it became tedious, almost. I moved a piece, broke eye contact with the board, then they moved a piece. Initially, I just turned my head away, but after catching the faintest glimpse of my opponent out of the corner of my eye, I resorted to squeezing my eyes shut until I heard the soft slide of felt pieces along the board. It was after that game that I realized I could no longer even see a door. The room was so impossibly long, I couldn't even see the end, that I felt overwhelmed in its vastness. I walked the rows for what felt like an eternity. It took even longer still because I hovered at the edge of where the light ended before finally accepting I'd need to venture into the darkness. I had only stepped somewhat into the shadows when I spotted it, the pieces gleaming white. In the distance, I was actually relieved to see the board for a split second, until I realized what the pieces were made out of. Each pawn a delicately carved and polished human finger bone, all of different lengths. Knights were made of carved jawbone. The teeth snagged on the ridges of my fingers as I touched one. I'd really rather not describe the other pieces. Hopefully, you will never need to find out. After staring in disgust for a while, I realized that there was a pawn missing. I looked around for it, under the table, at the surrounding ones. I waited patiently until I noticed the long knife sitting by the board. I called out for help, not for the first time, but this time thinking that perhaps, since it was related to the game, I'd get some response. My voice didn't echo in the room. It was more so like I was screaming in a gale. It went nowhere and was swallowed up by the vastness. I shrugged and eventually moved a knight, repeating the tradition of averting my eyes while the other side moved. I heard the telltale sound of the piece being dragged across the board, but when I looked up, I realized it was my own knight. It had been moved back to its starting position. I tried it again, moving a pawn, a bishop, before eventually coming to the conclusion that it wouldn't let me proceed until I had a full set of pieces. I realized, sickeningly, what that meant. I studied the dyed pieces across from me, the pale gray dye that stained and settled into every jagged cut and scrape in the bone. If it would get me closer to leaving this place, it was worth it, I told myself. A strategic sacrifice. I worked as quickly as I could, trying so hard to ignore the excruciating pain paired with the heavy scent of copper. Hazy thoughts of running out those doors motivated me as I worked. I tried to picture leaving behind the endless room with its gruesome Technicolor paintings, juxtaposed with the encroaching darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I placed my left pinky, which for the past 30 years had been attached to the rest of me, on the table, panting. I heard that sound, the rustle of dried leaves or perhaps ancient leather, while something moved behind me. It reached over my shoulder before I realized what was happening and snatched the severed digit away. I had seen the thin and shriveled limb of my host out of the corner of my eye, but found myself frozen in place and unable to move to look at its owner. Whether it was the rules of that place or something in my own mind trying to spare me from the sight, I still do not know. All I know is that I wished it had also spared me the sound, the ripping, the carving, the chewing. After what felt like an eternity, they placed the perfectly clean and polished pawn on the board. I struggled to focus and ignore the pain and sound of the blood dripping along the table as spots bloomed across my vision. Perhaps it was the blood loss, but at one point I found myself giddily thinking at least it wasn't a night. The game was extremely difficult, but the thought of what I'd have to give up if I lost drove me to hold my focus. Finally, checkmate. Something told me that no matter what happened, the next game would be my last. For a fleeting moment, I felt that no matter the outcome, it couldn't possibly be worse than another match in this place. Dizzy, exhausted, I dragged myself through the shadows and into the absolute darkness. There was no way to tell where the room ended, if it did at all. I found my mind wandering, wondering whom or what else was in the darkness with me, perhaps silently weaving around tables, movements disguised by my weary, dragging footsteps. I tried to push those thoughts out of my head, searching endlessly for the board, and then I spotted it, a small and bright white light in the darkness. It nearly blinded me at first, as my eyes had long adjusted to the darkness, but it certainly hadn't been what I was expecting. There were no pieces on the board at all. On it sat only my cell phone, unlocked, screen pulled up to a rapid challenge game. I closed it out, frantically swiping through only to realize that I had no service, not even for emergency calls. I had no other apps on my phone, even when I searched for texting, internet, nothing. Only the one chess app, only the one game. It took me a few moments to realize that this time I was the player with no name, no country, no picture. I realized what I was supposed to do. I wasn't going to throw the game. I wasn't going to trade places with someone. But it had matched me against someone that was nearly 1500. Perhaps it sensed my hesitancy going in. I held my own quite well, considering. After our game, sunlight came streaming into the windows, my eyes watering up from the rapid return of the light. It was still 13:45. The room was back to its original size, and when I darted into the hallway, the sudden return of sound made me jump. I nearly ran over a tourist. The entire palace was full of people taking photos. I ran down the stairs, as if my life depended on it, only afterwards realizing that I had all 10 fingers, although a faint, jagged scar encircled my pinky like a piece of macabre jewelry, a grim souvenir. And then, well, you know the rest. I'm sorry, I really am. I didn't receive a warning, but sending this is the least I can do. I hope you believe me, and please, when you receive it, do not accept the invitation to the night tournament.